Could it be that this is the foundation for building our new community? Our actions resting on the callus of civility and virtues become new bone, and then they're the blood vessels, the paths of communication reaching across the divide of uncertainty, not certain where they will find a connection on the other side, but they start seeking, cleaning, drafting to form a connection. And the nourishment of love, relationships, the acts of justice bring together this beloved community. So that's the nourishment that keeps it going. So we know that this miracle does happen with bone, but we also know that it helps to provide the right conditions for this to happen. These vessels and callus and spongy bone don't just leap across vast open spaces on their own. We have to bring the broken pieces together. We have to bring them in proximity to each other. We have to set the bone in order for the bone to heal. And we've been talking a lot over this series about how to bring the bones into closer proximity by exploring the complexities of civility and its twin daughters, relationships and justice. So playing with this metaphor a little bit. So you might think, okay, Dee Dee, metaphors are all well and good, but how does really reconciliation really happen? How does this really, what does it look like? How do we make it happen? So let's explore this a little bit more. I think one of the conditions, necessary conditions for reconciliation is seeing another person. And we've talked through the series a little bit about the Zulu greeting Sawubona, which means I see you. And the response Nikona means I am here. And when I visited a maximum security correctional facility, I met individuals whom we have made invisible in our society. And I noticed when I began to see them not as prisoners, but as people with interest and values and talent and wisdom that have been imprisoned because of a mistake that they have made, I saw something else. I see you. I see the divine within you. And their response was a resounding, please, please see me. I am here. Because I think people who are incarcerated very much feel that they have been made invisible, rendered invisible by our society. So that connection was so very, very powerful. I see you as a human being. And that response of thank you for seeing me and remembering that I'm here and seeing me as a human being. So think in your own lives of people that you need to see, the people you need to see as persons, not just as labels that we place upon them. You practiced earlier in the series seeing and making eye contact with another person, and this was good practice, but now you're ready to see persons to whom you've turned away in the past, or persons you've never bothered in your experience to seek out and engage, to know. So we have lots of opinions about lots of different issues, and we live in a very complex time in which we're supposed to have opinions on every issue imaginable. But do we really know the people behind our opinions on these issues? What if we see the person who is navigating immigration? What if we see the person who is living in homelessness? What if we see the person who is incarcerated and warehoused someplace out of our sight in our society? What if we actually see the person who holds different values than we do? So this idea of reconciliation, I don't think can happen until we first see each other. Okay? The second condition is turning toward another person. Sometimes we see another person, but we turn away from them. We separate ourselves. So separation, not reconciliation, seems to be favored in all sorts of different contexts. This particular image I'm showing you is from Northern Ireland. It's a peace wall. It's got to be 90 feet high, separating Catholics and Protestants to this day in Northern Ireland. So that's separation. So I see that there are people on the other side of that wall, but I'm building a wall and I'm separating myself. I'm not going to turn toward this other person. We see the same thing in South Africa, 25 years post-apartheid, with millions of people still living outside of the city in townships It's difficult to get to work. It's difficult to get transportation. They're separated from the rest of the living residential areas in the city. Separation seems to be a solution employed by a wall between Israel and Palestine, doesn't it? We see you on the other side, but we're going to separate ourselves. Recent research still supports a statement made by Martin Luther King 50 years ago that Sunday morning church hour in the United States is the most segregated hour of the week. We separate our neighborhoods. Separation, this idea is driving our immigration policy, our political policy, our racial policies in the country, that we're just build a wall, just build a wall. Metaphorically, if not literally, we build a wall, okay? So first condition for reconciliation, seeing another person. Second condition is turning toward the person that we're seeing. The third condition is engaging with another person. Sometimes we see the person, sometimes we even turn toward the person, but we refuse to engage the person. So this particular mural is a picture that I took in Northern Ireland in Belfast, and you see these all over the city. And again, school children walking through the neighborhood have to walk by these very terrifying images of people with semi-automatic weapons and balaclavas over their faces. So they see the other person, turn toward the other person, but refuse to engage, and are very clearly sending a message: do not enter this neighborhood. Do not come any closer, because we are armed and we are ready to defend ourselves. And I think that you can think of ways in which we do this, not quite this dramatically, in the way that we refuse to engage other people in our own society, in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities, in our own churches. There are good examples, I think, of bringing people together. And sometimes it's easier to see the examples in another country than it is to see the examples in our own personal lives. So it's much more difficult work when it comes down to our personal lives. So Corrie Mela, for example, is a peace and reconciliation center in Northern Ireland. And one of the things that they do and have done all during the Troubles and at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland was to bring IRA people and Ulster paramilitaries together. And they bring them to this retreat center, and they have them sit down together and drink tea together. And when you have to see the other person, when you can't turn away from the other person, you have to engage them over a pot of tea and be civil. Suddenly, those differences started to break down. Some of the hate started to break down. It was much more difficult to hate the person who was sitting across the table drinking a cup of tea with you. And that was the part of that engagement. All three of those things were there. Another example of that, I would say, is in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that whole process of telling the stories of the atrocities of apartheid was turning toward those stories and the people and their suffering and engaging that suffering. And it was broadcast on the radios. There was really no way that you could avoid hearing these stories as they processed through that particular, and just such a wonderful example of how that can happen in a country. So if it can happen in Northern Ireland, and it can happen in South Africa and other places around the world, I think it can also happen here. So when we look at this idea of reconciliation, seeing, turning, engaging, civility doesn't just happen. We have to set an environment. We have to create a place where people feel comfortable being together, that it's not my place or their place, but it's a neutral place where we can engage. We need to develop our communication skills. And we've talked about some of those skills throughout this series, that we can't just sit down and say we're going to magically have dialogue. We've got to practice these skills in order to be able to do this work. We need to understand each other. So we need to really educate ourselves and engage with each other so that we explore our identities and our relationships. If we don't know each other, it's going to be much more difficult to bridge any sort of divides. And then that idea of embracing conflict, leaning into conflict, seeing it as an opportunity for growth and transformation rather than something that we have to run away from, and engaging those emotions. So part of what we started with today, that appreciative inquiry, talking about how we feel about these things is a good place to start to lean into these issues. And then comes the work of building alliances, finding where our common values are and working toward justice and working for the betterment of our community, that hopefully we all share those ideals of what it means to live in a very vibrant, flourishing community that serves the needs of all of its members. So it takes several steps to this process, and each one of those steps I think is critical to the success. I would be remiss if we talked about reconciliation without talking about lamentations and the idea that we have to provide a space, an opportunity for lamentations before we say, oh, let's go ahead and fix everything and all come together in a happy hug. So reconciliation really becomes a sort of pleasant cliche unless we honor the hard work of lamentation. And I turned to Alan Bosak. He has a book entitled The Tenderness of Conscience. And this concept was first introduced by Kuyper in 1931 and then kind of resurrected by Bosak in the 2005. It's that particular book. And he writes that the incivility and divisiveness of our day are spiritual as well as social sins. And we are called to repentance. And Bosak writes, Bosak, just to put him in a little context, is a Black theologian in South Africa. He's visited Holland, Michigan, and Hope College a number of times. If you're familiar with the Belhar Confession on Race that has been adopted by the RRCA and the CRC, if you're familiar with that, he was one of the writers of the Belfast Confession. But he writes, it is not in withdrawing into ourselves that we find God. And I am going to duck under my desk for just a moment. For some reason, my computer is not charging. And okay, maybe now it's happy. I think my cord just slipped out, but I got that notice that I was running out of battery. You might lose me altogether here in a minute. I think I'm back charging again. My apologies for that. So Bosak writes, it's not in withdrawing into ourselves that we find God. Therein lies the tenderness of conscience that I am pleading for. It's not simply an inner voice that leads us to deeds of charity. It is the presence of love that demands justice, that cannot rejoice in the lie and that creates havoc within ourselves until justice is done. It is the piety that is subversive towards complacency within and the tolerance of wrongs without. So tenderness of conscience is about civility. If civility requires seeing another, turning toward another, engaging another, this idea that Bosak is proposing, this tenderness of conscience, he writes, quote, it is an openness to the wounds of others, risking vulnerability of ourselves such that we should not wish for wounds to be healed too quickly and for tears to dry too soon. It behooves us to weep with those who weep so that we can authentically rejoice when they rejoice. Drying their tears without first having cried with them is denying their right to tears. It is unholy impatience. So you may have had this experience in your own life when you are grieving, you have lost someone close to you, and inevitably there's someone that comes and says, oh, you should be fine now. You should be over this now. You should be all good. You should be done grieving now. I can't believe you're still grieving or you're still sad. How could that possibly be? You need to get on with your life, right? That's what Bosak is talking about with unholy impatience. The idea that we try to move on and brush over this process of lamentation too quickly, and until we have cried with those who weep, until we have been there with them through this process, we can't tell people to just move on. And that is a basis for reconciliation. And I think that's largely, in my own personal opinion, why it has taken us so long for racial reconciliation in the United States. We haven't allowed that opportunity for lamentations. When their lamentation starts to rise up, voices are starting to shout. We say, oh, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. Let's silence those voices. Get over it. Get over it. We're in a post-racial society. I don't know what you're still complaining about. We've got to move on. And that is not weeping with those who weep. That is not being there in the experience that they're experiencing. So this idea of sweep it under the rug, move on, love Jesus, is not something that I think is helpful as we try to reach reconciliation. So providing space for lament, what does this look like? Lament reveals the wounds, the trauma, the loss, and the grief transmitted over generations, and recognizing how trauma carries through from generation to generation. And we stop to see this. We can see this in our own families. We can see it in families of people that we're close to, the way that this gets carried on. Psychic pain resides in the body. It resides in memory and in relational space with others. So this idea of bearing witness to another's lament is an important predictor of healing. So if we want lamentation to go more quickly, then we bear witness to a person's lament. We hear that lamentation. We hold that sacred space for lamentation. If we try to rush the process, it's going to take us a lot longer. With time, with voice, with being heard and acknowledged, we can move beyond lamentation. And this idea of coming out of lamentation is an opportunity, rather than being the object of somebody else's story and narrative, that we can claim of being the subject of our own narrative. It comes out of this idea of lamentation. So in summary, Roger Williams talks about allowing disagreement, even if it means lowering the bar of civility just a little bit to raise the level of discourse. We've talked about knitting communities back together, that idea of the callus of action, the blood vessels of communication that we need to build community across these fractures. We've talked about 3 conditions of reconciliation: that we have to see others, we have to turn toward others, we have to engage others, or a reconciliation really has no basis to be built. And we've talked about this concept of tenderness of conscience, the idea that love demands just as subversive piety and no unholy impatience, but a sacred place for lamentation, that lamentation is a part of reconciliation. Barack Obama had a quote that I think summarizes a lot of this. Hope is the belief that destiny will not be written by us or for us, but by us. By the men and women who are not content to settle for the world as it is, who have the courage to remake the world as it should be. So that is what we're talking about when we talk about hope to reconcile. I'm going to turn now toward the idea of liberality, the virtue of liberality. So not a word that we use very much in our contemporary language. Liberality is the quality of giving and receiving freely. It's a generosity of spirit as well as material goods. So Thomas Aquinas was asked, how, if you're poor, how can you practice liberality? And he responds that liberality is not in the multitude of gifts, but in the habit of the giver. It's a mindset as well as an action of giving freely. And I'm reminded of a story of Anne Lamott. Anne Lamott is a writer. And earlier in her life, she was a drug addict, and a serious drug addict. And she found herself, she writes this story about how she found herself one morning in a rather deserted area of Los Angeles. There are abandoned buildings around, the weeds coming up through the concrete, and she didn't know how she had gotten to this place. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know how she'd gotten there. She's pretty down and out. She hears music in the distance, and she follows the sound of this music. And she gets closer and closer to the music, and she discovers an African-American gospel church. And she opens the door, and she goes into this church, and she sat in the back, and she talks about just being overwhelmed and sobbing with feeling this love and the vibrancy of the music and people in worship. And she started coming. She found herself drawn back to this church, back to this community week after week, she followed the music and she sat in the back, kind of separated from the group. And at one point, this elderly woman, a member of the church community, comes up to her and presses this little baggie of dimes into her hand and gives her this baggie of dimes. And she accepts this baggie of dimes. And then every week when she comes back, this woman finds her and she presses this baggie of dimes into her hands. And here's a woman who is living in abject poverty, has nothing to give, but she saves her dimes every week. And she brings them to church in a baggie and she presses them into the hands of somebody that she just sees is suffering, somebody who needs help. So every week this continues. So Anne Lamott pulls her life back together. She goes into rehab. She sets her life on recovery. She becomes an internationally famous author. She has a tremendous, her needs are met at this point. She has a number of books out and still she goes to this church and still this woman finds her each Sunday pressing that little baggie of dimes into her hands. And she writes about how she still accepts this baggie of dimes because it reminds her of this idea of liberality, to give everything. This woman is giving everything when she has nothing, and to be able to receive freely. And she is receiving this gift, this heart-wrought gift in return of this baggie of dimes. So this idea of liberalitas, the Latin foundation of liberality. Aquinas writes about this, and he talks about it coming from the words largesse and liberty, the root from largesse and liberty. So that largesse, this idea of giving freely, and liberty, freedom. And he writes, quote, when someone sends forth from himself, in a sense, he liberates it from his custody and dominion and shows that his soul is free from attachment to it. So that by these acts of giving freely, giving in abundance, we are liberating ourselves. We are liberating our souls. Only then are we free. There is, I put the citation at the bottom, the Esalen has an excellent article on this virtue of liberality and this idea of giving freely in return. And he writes, he talks about how freedom is, we talk about it as our right to do whatever we want, is how we think of freedom. But he says that's really not the word, that's not the concept of freedom, because that's divorced from community, relationships, and the needs of others. It's all about the individual self, right? I have freedom to do this and declare what I want to do. And he writes, but when I freely receive and freely give, only then am I free. So I give up my attachments. I give with such abundance and generosity, and I receive with abundance and generosity. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about this virtue of liberality. And it's so nicely reflected in this quote from, or this anecdote from Mother Teresa. So a reporter says, in observing her, I wouldn't do that for $1 million, as she's caring for people who are very sick. And she responded, neither would I. It's not about what I receive. It's not about receiving something. It's about giving. It's about giving. So how do we do this? Daniel Hill, in a more recent book called White Awake, talks about moving from deficit motivations to asset motivations. So when we find ourselves operating from a philosophy of scarcity, I've got to protect what's mine, then we need to work toward how do we wrap our heads around an idea of abundance, that I will be provided for, I will be fine, my family will be fine, I have an abundance I can give to other people without being scared of scarcity. So when we find ourselves in positions of difference that in my opinion is different from those people on the other side, where do I reach out and develop that asset motivation of similarity? There are things that we share. We share a common humanity. We share many values, although some of the more salient values at the moment, we focus on the difference. Okay? When I am responding and living in a state of anger, how do I find peace? How do I cultivate that in my life? as a motivation for my actions. So he goes on and talks about, sometimes we make excuses for ourselves. Well, I don't understand about Black Lives Matter. I don't understand what they're protesting about. And his response is, change that deficit to an asset. Educate yourself. You might think, I don't understand why people are complaining about this. Then you make yourself proximate to suffering. Go find out. Go stand with people who are suffering and see what they are experiencing. So put yourself proximate to suffering. If we only hang out, read with people who think just like we do, he says, expand your network to include other voices, other people, other positions, other perspectives, other experiences. Okay? If we have an attitude of, I just want to go in and fix this problem, and I know the best way to fix it, what we should be doing is serving under the leadership of others. Okay, so changing these deficits to assets. Another aspect on this liberality to act is changing the narrative. So they're dominant narratives that we just buy into, that are in the news media. It's the way the story is always told. And a very useful exercise is to turn that upside down, turn that narrative inside out, and try to see it from another perspective. I'm going to show you a quick clip here. Let me end the show over here. That is an example of changing the narrative, changing the dominant narrative. Okay. And Judy, you're seeing my screen okay? The video? Oops, you're muted.
Yeah.
Yep. Excellent.
You're seeing your edit screen. There we go. Okay, I think we got it.
Okay.
We don't have sound yet.
Good grammar and
Now
spelling.
we have sound.
No, we don't want good grammar and spelling. I think this has gone back to a previous video here. There we go.
Colonization can be termed as historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. It's trauma after trauma happening over and over again.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is really the direct assault on the most critical part of the culture, the relationships.
When there are no resources, when people are looking at you as though you're actually already a criminal, when there is the unprocessed trauma and not the strong attachments to your caregivers, all of that stuff can compound.
If the trauma isn't healed, the trauma will be repeated. Either you are going to act out that trauma and hurt somebody else as you were hurt, or you will act in and hurt yourself.
This notion of good guys and bad guys is really false. Every single one of my clients have had an incredibly traumatic past.
Most often, if a young person does something wrong, instead of helping them to repair the harm, it's mostly focusing on how much punishment we need to give that young person. Most often, it doesn't teach them anything. It's just all about power and control for our young people.
The most arrests happen in Chicago during school hours in school.
Where there is oppression, there is harm, there is danger, there is conflict.
Ours is a justice system that harms people who harm people to show that harming people is wrong. And so our system just replicates that harm.
And you put gangs in this box, you put authority figures or the guards in the box, you put weapons in the box, drugs, racism, probably a few other different things. And every now and then you shake up this box and there's no way outside of the box.
Healing is not dependent on someone else's suffering.
The way I would like to discuss restorative justice is to talk about incarceration not as your primary instrument of social control, but the last instrument of social control, with restorative things happening prior to incarceration, and that you structure them in to your justice system.
One of the things the victim's family needs to know is there remorse? Are you sorry? Do you know the impact of what you did to me and to my family? The one who did the harm needs to be held accountable, but not demonized, not labeled as a thug or a thief or a killer, but rather held accountable, but with support and care of a community.
So hurt people transforms into healed people, healing other people.
Love is work. Love is sacrifice. Love is truth. Love is your ability to really look at what is real and then make a commitment to make it more pure, to make it more sacred. That's the true work. That's the true social justice work.
Okay, so the purpose of that clip is just to show an example. It's a trailer for a movie that you can look up for more information if you're interested. But it changes the narrative, doesn't it? So rather than seeing people who perpetrate crimes that they must receive retribution, it changes the narrative and say, how do we work toward restoration? That benefits all of us, doesn't it? Rather than seeing people as evil, we're seeing them as also victims of trauma, not minimizing the trauma that they have imposed perhaps on others, but also recognizing that they too are victims of trauma. It's both and. Rather than seeing them as people who are out to destroy the system, that perhaps they're reacting to a hopeless environment and a hopeless future where they didn't see other choices available to them. How do we provide those other choices in order to prevent people from falling into this pattern of recurrent incarceration over the time of their life? So this idea of changing the narrative. I want to show you another funny example of changing the narrative. So very often we have a narrative about Africa that we need to go in as white Westerners and save Africa, right? And so this next clip I'm going to show you is a kind of fun example that turns that narrative on its head. It turns it upside down. And even though it's done for humor, it also sends some messages to us too about being a little more humble in our perspectives and efforts and things that we do in the name of helping Africa. So I'm going to
I'm basically heading up a team that's getting Africans together in this time of need for Norway, you know, helping them out. A lot of people aren't aware what's going on there right now. But it's kind of just as bad as poverty, if you ask me. Sunlight puts smiles on people's faces. People don't ignore starving people, so why should we ignore cold people? Frostbite kills too. Africa, we need to make a difference in Norway. We need to collect our radiators, ship them over there, and spread some warmth, spread some light, and spread some smiles. Say yes to Radiate.
anti-corruption with a jungle of crime. Now we gave up and then they taught us what to do. And now it's playtime. Now the tables are turned. Now we know no way. There's no way we can close our eyes. We see that they free. As Africans concerned, just enemies is all the way.
Okay, so that was a humorous changing of the narrative, but also very poignantly makes some very important points that we so often simplify Africa and put an entire continent in one small box, and that we frame them as victims and we frame them as recipients of charity. And as the video so poignantly reminds us, we frame them as recipients of some really bad song videos used to raise money on their behalf.
Can we go to
frame
full
them as
screen,
helpless.
Deidre, can we go to full screen?
Yes, thank you. So this idea of changing the narrative. The last point I want to make in terms of liberality to act is finding inspiring leaders. Find the people who, one of the things that is helpful to me, because I am not good at liberality. This is something I need to cultivate and work on in myself. And in fact, even talking about this today reminds me just how far short I fall in terms of liberality to act. But I look to examples of people that I know in my life that do this and do this extraordinarily well, and try to be reminded of their examples. One is John McCourt, a friend in Derry, Northern Ireland. John was in Bloody Sunday as a 17-year-old, and he was running across that square as the British were firing upon the protesters in Northern Ireland. His best friend was about 20 feet behind him, running behind him. He has photographs. His friend was shot and killed. As a response to that violence that happened to him and that loss, he became an IRA bomb maker. And this idea of violence begets violence, doesn't it? So his friend is lost in this episode. He becomes an IRA bomb maker. To this day, I have no idea how many people's lives were lost at his hands because of the bombs that he made. At one point when he was making bombs for the IRA, one malfunctioned and blew up in his face. So you can see the right side of his face, maybe not quite as much in that photo, is terribly scarred, where he lost part of his face and part of his ear that has been reconstructed. And it was that being in the hospital and recovering over months and months and months that he decided to shift his life and change his life, quit the IRA, and work for peace and justice and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. And he has done so ever since. So now he travels around the world. He was involved with the peace negotiations in Colombia a couple of years ago with FARC. He works for justice in terms of people that were institutionalized in Northern Ireland in orphanages and were abused, and bringing those stories to light and seeking justice decades after those abuses happened. And so he, to me, is one of those inspiring people, as is Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I just absolutely adore and think he's absolutely phenomenal. Father Michael Lapsey is a Anglican priest who was in South Africa, went into exile. He's originally from New Zealand, received a letter bomb, and it was right at the time that Mandela was coming out of prison and things were changing in South Africa. So they were so close to the end end of this, and he was an activist. He was sent a letter bomb. He lost both his hands and one eye, and now works for peace and reconciliation and runs a center for the healing of memories in South Africa. Another quick example, Guayasamín, Eduardo Guayasamín is an artist that I discovered recently. Does incredible work portraying oppression and exploitation, but also hope. And one of his pieces has the quote beside it: "For the children that death took while playing, for the men that dimmed while working, for the poor that failed while loving, I will paint with the scream of a shotgun and the power of thunder and the fury of battle." And this quote is outside his home in Quito, Ecuador. So looking to those inspiring leaders that inspire us along this path. So summary for what we've talked about with liberality: we need to change our motivations from deficits to assets. We need to change the dominant narrative. Always question, play with that narrative, turn it inside out, and see what the other story is that's not being told. Find inspiring leaders in your own life. We looked at this particular visual at the very beginning of our time together of our series, the idea that civility is interconnected with community, with justice, with developing relationships, with being with conflict, leaning into conflict, living with conflict, with the pursuit of truth, and using these communication skills to build community and civility. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he talks about, he said, imagine if you were in heaven now, you would notice the tears in God's life. The tears streaming down God's face as God looked on us and saw the awful things that we, God's children, do to each other. And then you might see a smile that was breaking over God's face, like sunshine through the rain, like a rainbow. And you would see God smiling because God was looking at you. God was noting how you were concerned. And that smile might break into a laugh as God said, "You have vindicated me. I had been asking myself, whatever got into me to create that lot? And then I see you. Yes, you. You are beginning to wipe the tears from my eyes because you care. Because you care, and you have come to learn that you are not your brother's or sister's keeper. You are your brother's brother and your sister's sister." So on that note, I will stop the screen share and we can come back to full group and talk.
Please, if you have a question or comment, unmute yourself and speak up. And I'll try to direct questions to Deidre unless she wants to respond directly.
I have a comment. Can you hear me?
Go ahead with your comment. I know you have background noise, but try your best to communicate with us. Or perhaps can you write yours in the chat? We're getting a lot of feedback.
It's hard to do in chat because it's wrong. Is there so much background distortion?
That's right. So could you type your question as a chat and then we'll get it to DJ.
Oh, Lord Almighty. I have trouble.
Could you mute yourself again? Thank you. Thank you. Please mute Suzanne.
It was more of a comment than a question in a way.
Thanks for muting yourself, Suzanne, and we look forward to seeing your comment in chat. Meanwhile, is there another person who wants to unmute yourself and make a comment or ask a question?
Deirdre and Judy, this is Anne. And I find myself to be tongue-tied and shy in trying to figure out how to respond to someone in kind of an extreme situation. And I can give you an example. I was having lunch at Evergreen Commons, where it's very normal for people to sit down with people they don't know. And I sat down with this very nice two ladies. And my mother and father always taught us not to discuss religion and politics. So I try to keep those topics off the table, especially with people I just met. But somehow, this was right after John McCain had died. And somehow John McCain came up in the conversation, and one of these little ladies got absolutely apoplectic, that he was a terrible, bad person. And I responded, but wait, he was a war hero, and he followed his own conscience. And she was shaking so badly. She was so angry. And I asked why she thought he was a bad person. And she just took her thumb and turned it down, which, if you'll remember, John McCain, when he voted against the repeal of the ACA, that's how he did it. And I was just flabbergasted. I was speechless, and her friend was speechless. And clearly we were not going to change her mind, but she just got so upset. And again, maybe afterwards I thought of things I could have said, but at the time we just sort of dropped the subject.
I think it's very true, Anne, that when we're in the moment, it is so difficult sometimes to come up with the right response, or to even imagine how we might respond to a difficult situation like that. And perhaps a reminder is, I think, by asking a question, and you said you asked a question, and maybe ask additional questions, that might be a way of engaging a person to explore their thinking in a little more depth. But then it sounds like she was so very upset in this setting that that's probably not going to be the situation in which you're going to be able to really engage in the sort of ladder of inference and the ladder of inquiry to go deeper into why she thinks the way that she does, and to be able to offer counter perspectives if she's that upset. And sometimes when somebody's upset, to ask, where they're feeling, what they're feeling, and where that feeling's coming from, can be a way to, once you're able to express the feeling, like, whoosh, okay, somebody's listening to me, that then maybe you're able to have that more constructive conversation. But when somebody is that agitated, it's very difficult to do.
Why are people so agitated on certain topics?
For that, we need to engage in appreciative inquiry, don't we? To find out what is their experience. Why does this particular issue give life to them and live in them in the way that it does? And again, I think unpacking those feelings underneath it is the place to start to uncover that.
This book I'm reading now, it's So Why Are We Polarized? It argues that our political position is now our identity.
Yes.
So that's why it's so important to us. It's all wrapped up in our identity nowadays. It used to be, the book started talking about 1950, where the parties weren't different at all. Each party had liberals to conservatives and liberals to conservatives, and they were actually worried back then that they weren't differentiated enough. And then that sort of changed in the 80s, but now it's if you believe this, then you're this, it's part of our identity.
I think, thinking back on my experience, it makes me, I'm afraid I'm pessimistic about the state of our country right now, because clearly what had happened to this clearly sweet little old lady was that she was believing every word that President Trump said.
Mm-hmm.
And if 30% of our country is in that position, in spite of all of your wonderful contributions, I question, question, and of course, right now the social media is just adding to this, which was something we didn't have in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to be optimistic when so many people have such, they're so entrenched in these beliefs.
It's complicated and it's scary. And we've got to start to unpack, deconstruct these belief systems and I think explore them, and it's step by step, and it's going to take time and it's going to take diligence to get to some truths based on some facts. And if things are being put out there as facts that aren't true, we have to address those. And again, to Jean's point, the extent to which our political viewpoints have become an identity. When somebody attacks one of our identities, that's core, that's visceral, that's right in your gut. And that's why I think we see such strong responses and defensiveness from people anytime that we attack an identity. That leads to great conflict and great defensiveness. But somehow we've got to start this process of taking apart piece by piece and getting to what are the real facts here? Where does the truth lie? And it is a daunting task. And I share some of your pessimism, and that I think social media perpetuates information so much more quickly than we can deconstruct it and analyze it. And it just perpetuates and perpetuates. And it makes it a very challenging situation that we're in.
I think in some ways there are some cracks that are appearing in this process, and that is within Fox News. Now, there are certain news reporters that are calling lies, and there are other, of course, commentators that are very supportive of our current administration. But I think that within that network there, and our president himself is not as much in love with Fox News as he once was. That's a beginning. And I think as more people who are trusted leaders, even, especially Republican leaders, who are now beginning to say, it's time for our president to recognize reality. We've had an election. He did not win the popular vote. He is not likely to win. He hasn't won the electoral college as he did before. And that as that sinks in more and more, I think and I hope that people will begin to see reality. And I think the coronavirus also has a way of getting people to change their mind about wearing masks. For example, if they see members of their family who have not worn masks getting sick, that virus is very persuasive, and perhaps people will begin to question what they had assumed were facts and begin to open their minds. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Judy, I agree with you regarding facts. That the problem is that there are a couple of new networks. I think one's called Newsmax and the other OANN, that are even more like Fox than Fox. That's a big negative in terms of reality. I haven't watched those, but I've read about them, and when you can't have basic agreement on facts, that's a real problem. And the other comment I wanted to make was leadership's really important, because a lot of the people, including the woman, Ann, who you dealt with, probably who support Trump and listen to him as though it's the gospel truth, also supported other Republicans like Mitt Romney and John McCain and both Bushes, who were much more honorable people and were not demonizing their opponents. So I think a lot of this comes down to leadership. And right now, there's a huge void in one of our political parties. I think that's just basically a fact. And in terms of good leadership, I mean, Mitt Romney's still there, but nobody's following him. It's a real problem. I mentioned a few sessions ago that I'm, along with 2 other House members, involved in Braver Angels, where we're trying to bring together conservatives and liberals and talk about issues, not to try to convince each other of our positions, but to try to promote better understanding. And we're having a really difficult time getting conservatives to engage. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Deidre, but from what we've heard, and it's not just in Western Michigan, it's nationally, that the whole idea of civil engagement is a lot more appealing right now to blue people, liberals, than to reds. And what we understand is one of the reasons is that the reds are concerned that the blues are going to try to convince them to give up their views. And that's not the goal of Braver Angels, but that's apparently one of the concerns. So if you have any thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
I wish I did. I wish I had an answer there, but I think we're seeing something nationally that is, we have to keep trying, and we have to keep persisting in engaging in these conversations. But I think there's a defensiveness and walls being put up figuratively in front of people in defense of their position because they feel under attack. And partly maybe that comes from the media calling out some of these things and saying this is just simply not true, that they're being challenged on multiple fronts, and are less willing to engage in dialogue. So, but I think the answer is dialogue. That exactly with the Braver Angels organizations and others similar to it, of bringing people together. And again, focusing on that shared humanity. These are people. These are our friends. These are our neighbors. These are our family members. And they are complex people. They are not just their political position. So how do we reach out and connect and understand and listen to their fears that are underlying a lot of their responses to these issues? How do we hear those fears? How do we honor those fears and give other possibilities for ways of responding to those fears? But yes.
Okay, I'd like to now respond with the comment that Suzanne Harrington has typed. It's, I think, leading to a question, but some background, and she's got several messages coming here. I want to read them out loud so we can all see them together or hear them together. Suzanne writes, I was born here in Holland, a child of Roman Catholic faith, and was aware of the dominant Protestant denominations, and was aware of Hope College, but felt no fear of it. Upon moving to Hillsdale with my family when I was 14, there wasn't the dominance of a church. Let's see if we can get the rest of it. But Hillsdale College is now an adamant proponent of extreme conservatism. And upon returning to Holland, I find Hope a stellar example of a progressive example to be taken to heart. Comment.
I think in terms of Hope College, our identity is a liberal arts institution that promotes critical thinking and promotes its exploration of multiple perspectives and ideas in juxtaposition with a strong commitment to the historic Christian faith. We are unique. I mean, we really are unique among liberal arts institutions because of the faith-based foundation, and we're unique in terms of faith-based institutions in terms of a true commitment to the exploration of multiple perspectives and viewpoints that is consistent with a liberal arts education. And so you don't find many places that try to ride the edge of that razor blade and to hold both of those things in juxtaposition to each other. And it is at times very, very difficult for us because we have defined this position on the edge of a razor blade. And so we have a lot of, sometimes disagreement within the community because of that. And if you There was a professor that came to Hope from Calvin a number of years ago. And he said, at Calvin, we all agree. And you come in the door and you sign off on your statement of faith and your stuff, and you all agree. And we're able to engage some controversial issues better than Hope College is, because at Hope College, you're all questioning each other as to what you believe and what you believe in terms of your faith and how you live out your faith, because you're coming from a more ecumenical, diverse foundation of faith traditions. And I thought that was sort of interesting and in some ways true, that controversy is very threatening to us at the same time, because we are a diverse ecumenical community. And we don't exactly know what everybody believes because we haven't signed off on the same statement of faith. So it's both of those things. So we've defined a very difficult position to maintain. But what I love about Hope is that we've defined a very difficult position to maintain, both the liberal arts and the historic Christian faith, and that, yes, we can do both. And I think our new president, President Scogin, is very much committed to that idea of hope. It's okay. We're going to survive if we disagree and we have multiple opinions and perspectives at Hope College. This is a good thing. This is vibrancy in community. It's that kind of type of community we should be training our students to be able to engage, and not an echo chamber in which everybody says exactly the same thing.
It's education rather than indoctrination.
Thank you. Very well said, Judy.
I think one thing that strikes me, and somebody said it, and maybe Deirdre, you said it, that it's deconstructing our own belief systems. I come from a place, and I feel strongly that I have a strong basis for, let's say politically for the moment, believe in. But if I'm not willing to deconstruct how I got there, I'm not going to be open to a whole nother philosophy. I truly believe conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats all want the same end goal. We have different ways that we think is the best way to achieve it. But if I'm not willing to let go of my judgment of how the Republicans choose to get there, I'm not going to be able to have a truly meaningful conversation. I'm not going to be able to have a discussion where I can learn something instead of me theoretically imparting something on somebody else. So I think the biggest challenge is deconstructing our own individual belief systems even before we engage in conversation. Challenge ourselves, not the other person.
Very, very well said. Thank you for that. And I think that ladder of inference that we talked about last week is a way to do that, of really working down and asking ourselves the questions of where our beliefs and positions and actions come from. And then we're also in a better position of being familiar with that process to go through that with another person as well, to understand where their positions, beliefs, and actions come from.
We're down to our last minutes. Here's your last chance to talk to Deirdre or give a comment or ask a question by chat or by voice.
I would just say an incredible 5 weeks of information. And as Louise said earlier, we need to go back and start to digest, because it was an incredible amount of wonderful information and tools. So thank you.
Thank you, Deidre.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Judy Parr, for being a wonderful coordinator and helping to facilitate great discussion and just helping in so many different ways. But yeah, Professor Johnson, we just appreciate you so much and appreciate the commitment and the long commitment you had to this class. So we look forward to hopefully engaging with you at some point again. But
question for you, Susan. Is there a
Yes.
way that this material can be shared with other people? It's being recorded, I understand. Is there, can HASP members look at this again and maybe stop and start a recording and better digest these things that come like almost like water out of a fire hose to absorb all of this, to be able to get our thirst quenched?
Yeah,
Is there a way?
That's an excellent question. It would be a two-part answer. To be able to view this 5-part series, we'll be posting it on our HASP YouTube channel sometime around December 15th, and full instructions for this class and all the other fall curriculum classes will go out in a constant contact. So everybody will have the link. They'll be free to look at. You can go look at classes that you weren't originally signed up for.
Oh, good.
In that, you'll be able to obviously see the PowerPoint presentation as you go along and stop and back up. And as you said, kind of slow that fire hose down. So
Excellent.
Oh, that's wonderful. You know, thanks to technology, it's one of the silver linings to the pandemic.
If you want more comment into chat.
Okay, there's Suzanne has added something to the chat, something about is something or other is the mechanism for shutting out adversarial civil discussion. Something or other is the mechanism for shutting out.
I think it is there a mechanism, and I think you're probably on an iPad, which is hard to type on, but is there a mechanism for shutting out adversarial civil discussion?
Mechanism being something you can tap on your screen, or is there some sort of method or something in a communication skill that can deal with that, can shut that down? Deidre, maybe you can make sense out of that question.
I think it's important to engage with and seek out people to engage with who have motivations where they too really want to discern the best path forward. I think that anytime that we get into a contentious situation, people join extreme sides for various motivations. And John McCord is an example. I can remember him talking about when he was a youth in Northern Ireland and joining a paramilitary group and making bombs and blowing up pubs and shopping areas. He said, part of it was about the ideology behind Catholics versus Protestants, but part of it was about being a teenager and really wanting to be chaotic and ensue anarchy in a society and to stir things up. And I think we see the same thing with very adversarial positions that people have taken today, that there are mixed motivations. There are people out there, especially in the extreme points of our political spectrum, who are engaging in civil activities to promote civil unrest, to add flames, rather than to try to come to some sort of common understanding. And I think those are mixed motivations out there, and they probably perhaps care less about the political stance that they are advocating than about the activity around creating civil unrest. So is there a way to start reaching people from the middle and expanding that circle out, rather than first trying to take on the extreme adversarial positions, and that moving out progressively, expanding our circle, expanding the middle is perhaps a way to address that. And I hope, Suzanne, that addresses your question. If I've understood.
I want to clarify, and I think that someone else, Lois, said maybe that word is fear, the word I couldn't understand. Perhaps fear is the mechanism for shutting out adversarial civil discussion. So much of our response, fear is a very powerful emotion.
Yes. And Suzanne, I think you're absolutely right. I think that fear is underpinning very much the adversarial positions that people are taking. And that fear is real. And we can't deny that people are feeling that fear. And we can't say you shouldn't be fearful. That's a feeling, right? They are experiencing that. So if somebody is experiencing fear, we need to address that feeling is our first step toward mending and healing and bringing together. We have to dissipate, take apart, deconstruct, ameliorate that fear as a starting point. So very, very good point. Thank you, Suzanne.
I think we are well past our deadline here and people have other